just want to say good morning to everybody and welcome you here for our first kickoff summer coffee with the curator. Because we had such a good time in February doing it in the evening, we've decided since the material's already prepared, we might as well do it twice a day so we can serve our visitors that like to come in the morning as well as in the evening. I'm going to give you a little disclaimer. I did not start this preparation for this program as soon as I should have, now that I know how much material is out there on people flying machines over the Arkansas Grand Prairie. So in the hopes of trying to keep these presentations to about 20 to 30 minutes, I ended up limiting it to basically two pilots on pilots of the Prairie. So by the 1890s, we started seeing some tremendous fascination with flying machines throughout the world. And that was initiated by a German named Otto Lilienthal. Mr. Lilienthal was the first person to actually make repeated and well-documented glider flights, starting as early as 1891. But by 1896, we had seen some changes. So in May of that year, we saw the first successful flight of an unmanned steam-powered fixed-wing aircraft. I can't even imagine what that looked like. And then by midsummer, we started seeing several men gathering on the shores of Lake Michigan to also test various types of gliders. But August of 1896 actually brought the death of Mr. Lilienthal. So he became known as the father of flight, but he was also the first recorded fatality of a glider flight. So with that being said, he was also cited as being the catalyst by Orville and Wilbur Wright to become seriously interested in flight research. So the Wright brothers are interesting, and for multiple reasons. First of all, neither of them ever achieved a high school graduation, a high school diploma. The Wright family moved before Wilbur could get his diploma, even though he had completed all of his class requirements. And then Orville dropped out of school. So Orville started his own printing press. His brother joined in, and they ended up starting first a weekly newspaper and then a daily newspaper. And then they opened a bicycle shop called Wright Cycle Company and ended up even manufacturing their own bicycle brand by 1896. But by 1899, we know that they had written to the Smithsonian Institute to request information and articles on aeronautics. So by 1900, we find them in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, testing their own manned glider experiments. And then on December 14th of 1903, they made their first manned engine-powered test flight, also in Kitty Hawk. The Wrights had a tremendous influence on aviation in the States, and in one way they actually even influenced the naming of a child, who we'll hear a lot about later in the presentation. But in 1909, Jess Dockery and his wife Myrtle named their son, Jess Orville. He was actually meant to be named after the boy's father and Orville Wright. However, a misspelling on his birth certificate left him as O-R-V-A-L instead of O-R-V-I-L-L-E. They also influenced a native prairie pioneer by the name of Arthur Rhodes. So Arthur Rhodes was born on July 4th of 1894 here on the Arkansas Grand Prairie to Homer and Ida Rhodes. They were some of the earliest settlers who moved here after Burkle did, and H.E. Rhodes had a hardware store on Main Street. And by 1915, we see his son Arthur owning a local dry cleaning business. Well, Arthur also had a fascination with flying. And in mid-1915, he decided to build a plane, and he ordered a set of plans for $5 from Popular Mechanics magazine. So, of course, these things are getting invented as they kind of went along. But he begins building his plane in June of that year with the assistance of several people, an employee, but also a gentleman named Richard Schilberg. So they complete the plane in September, and one of the problems is that Arthur Rhodes also has no flight experience, so he took a correspondence course he also found in Popular Mechanics magazine. Now that first flight did not quite go as well as they had hoped. He only got about 10 feet off the ground. In fact, there was an article printed many years later, in 1941, that gave the details of that plane's construction. But it stated that though the plane lifted off the ground, it failed to fly, and Rhodes crashed. So how's that for very blunt, descriptive language? But then we meet our friend Richard Schilberg. Now, Mr. Schilberg was a few years older than Arthur Rhodes. He was actually born in 1887. And as an 18-year-old, he moved to Stuttgart in 1909 and opens his own welding shop. Initially, he specialized in agricultural machinery, but his focus quickly changed within a few years. So, on June 13th of 1913, Mr. Schilberg and his bride of just a few months, they got married, I believe, in January, they take their first flight at the Stuttgart Fairgrounds, which, for those of you who don't know, are basically where kind of El Canaveral is now, kind of to the east of the Lane, Arkansas offices. But this would have been extremely early in the history of aviation. The second documented flight occurring in Arkansas was in Pine Bluff, and it occurred 2 years before that. So this is very early. But soon thereafter, Schilberg begins building aircraft in assistance, or after he had assisted Arthur Rhodes with his plane. And like Arthur Rhodes, he learned how to do it from a correspondence course in Popular Mechanics magazine. He begins building his planes from his company, which was Stuttgart Welding Company, and it was located somewhere near where Chit Chat and Chew is now on Main Street. So it would have been about that Lincoln and Main Street area. It's he kicks everything off right about the end of World War I. So, end of 1918 or so, he begins building these planes, and this was considered to be the first aircraft factory in the state of Arkansas. So, by 1922, within just a few short years, he had purchased 3 planes specifically for passenger service, and he wanted to establish service from Stuttgart in all directions. He ran his first ad in the Stuttgart, Arkansas area in February of 1922, and he was offering rides for $5 for one person, but if you buddied up, you could get them for $7.50. I think it's interesting to note at this point in the presentation, he advertises no thrillers, no stunting, and no foolishness. This will become interesting very shortly. And his planes were piloted, as he claimed, by a former second lieutenant of the U.S. Aviation Corps. So he was employing people who actually had training beyond a correspondence course, we hope. He also begins selling and building, selling, and delivering planes out of state. So at this point, we're going to mention 2 specific employees. One of them was our friend J.O. Dockery, who at this point is now living in Pine Bluff. But the second one is a gentleman named John Q. Williams. Mr. Williams will have he'll have a kind of a wrap up to the story at the end of the presentation, but he's interesting for 2 reasons. And the first one being, Mr. Williams was an employee of Stuttgart Welding, but he was also a black man. And he was the first man to do a parachute jump in this area. So he did that on June 17th of 1922. He jumped from 2,400 feet into a rice field irrigated with 2 feet of water standing in it. So obviously he made quite a splash. But but Schilberg's dream was to make Stuttgart the flying headquarters for the state and also a way station for the entire country. He had planned to build a field with hangars, mechanics, supplies, and flight lessons. And his hope was to put Stuttgart on the air map of the South and keep a flock of planes over the city most all of the time. So throughout the early 20s, he continued building planes as well as seeking land and assistance to build this airfield. So he repeatedly asked the citizens of Stuttgart for their help with building hangars. He had a lot of trouble finding land to lease on a very lengthy basis. So he was at a disadvantage for many years. I'd say by the mid part of the 20s, he eventually leased land that was part of the old Burkle farm, northwest of town. And it was near Washington and Burkle. So you can see it kind of on this map. So here's the Days Inn, here's the hospital. It would have been somewhere in this area. And that will play a larger role in the presentation a little later on as well. And I've seen a lot of things Glenn has written that talked about where the golf course was at some point out there in relation to where that airfield was. But by 1926, he had established a solid reputation. He had built 28 planes and sold them and delivered them, some of them as far away as Chicago. And he also was operating a flight school. So he advertised his flight school as being taught by experienced pilots, offering now a 10-day flight course. So we've progressed quite a bit from the 1909, 1915 era of correspondence courses. But this is where we see the wheels start to come off for Mr. Schilberg. So in 1926, June of that year, he and his wife Gladys, who was also a pilot, and she was largely instrumental in the construction of the planes. She did a lot with the fabrics that they used, even to the point it talks about the canvas she used, the tape she used, they called it dope, and it was several layers to keep that fabric intact. But they divorced. And they divorced on the grounds of Gladys's infidelity with a gentleman who attested to this infidelity by the name of Ivan Shores. Well, a few months later, in October of that year, we see a mass tragedy. Mr. Schilberg had been taking passengers up for flight himself that day. And there was a young man, 21 years old, his name was Paul Trotter. Mr. Trotter had just moved to Stuttgart 3 days prior to this flight. And he convinced Schilberg to take him up for a second flight. And it says Schilberg was attempting a banking turn after performing some loops. So he's clearly gone on to some stunts and foolishness when the plane turned on its side and crashed. So Schilberg ended up with a broken nose and some facial bruises, but Mr. Trotter actually passed away in that crash. So things they're not going so well for Mr. Schilberg. Well, 5 months later, we see a lawsuit come to trial where Mr. Schilberg has actually sued a man. He's filed suit for $50,000 against a man named B.E. Cheney. And he was alleging Mr. Cheney had also engaged in infidelity with Mrs. Schilberg and was alleging alienation of affection. Well, part of the testimony in that trial was from Mr. Shores, who attested he had had an inappropriate relationship with Mrs. Schilberg. But Mr. Shores, during this trial, testifies that he had only been delivering batteries to the Schilberg home when Mr. Schilberg forced him at gunpoint to sign this attestation that he had had inappropriate relationships with his wife. Also in that trial, it's alleged that Mr. Schilberg is having an inappropriate relationship with their housekeeper, a young lady named Mabel Stelzen. So in the newspaper headline at that time, we see the crowd listening in on the scandal case, and the jury returns verdict for Cheney in just 11 minutes. And in just 2 days after the conclusion of that trial, we see Mr. Schilberg's marriage certificate to our young housekeeper, Mabel Stelzen. Around that same time, of course, the economy is spiraling into a depression. And Stuttgart was actually considering closing their schools due to a lack of money. So they're clearly not able to help support an airport at this point. Mr. Schilberg then moves his new bride to Wichita, Kansas, where he is now in good company with 8 other airplane manufacturers, including the ones we still know today of Beechcraft, Cessna, Laird, and Stearman. And he also has a new business partner, Mr. Williams. So the gentleman who he convinced to jump out of a plane with a parachute is now his business partner there in Wichita. So on the flip side, he did have a little improvement. By 1929, he did actually have a pilot's license. And if you'll notice on the bottom, it is signed by Orville Wright. So now we're going to go back a little bit to 1909 when we meet our friend Jess Dockery. He was born around the Dallas area, but his father moved the family to Lawton, Oklahoma in the late teens, early 20s, and his father ran a jitney service. So the young boy became quickly acquainted with airplanes because being on the airfield quite a bit. Although he was never really in one, never flew in one, he had a keen interest, and so he had kind of started gaining some exposure to those planes. But by 1921, the Dockery family relocates again to Corpus Christi, Texas. And that is where young Mr. Dockery, Master Dockery, meets a gentleman named Barney Flowers. Flowers was a barnstormer. And Flowers landed his plane one day in the middle of a cow pasture as our young Jess is nearby. And of course he beats a move and he goes over there and he wants to see the plane. So this fella says, I tell you what, I'll take you up on a flight if you'll watch my plane while I'm gone. Due to the amount of canvas that was used in the construction of these planes at the time, it was really important that the cattle not gain access to the plane. Or goats, they eat the canvas, we're in big trouble, nobody's flying. Well, Dockery quickly agrees. His brother tells his parents, hey, he's over there watching the plane, and brother begins bringing this young man bologna sandwiches. And he ends up staying there for 3 days watching this guy's plane. So true to his word, Mr. Flowers returns and he takes young Jess on a flight one day. And they take off and land about 4 or 5 times throughout communities in South Texas. And at this time, Dockery is actually able to follow what Mr. Flowers is doing with a dual pilot control. So he's kind of getting a feel for everything. Well, Flowers offers him the opportunity to watch his plane a second time. And by this time, all the kids in the neighborhood have figured out what's going on. So on this day number 2, after he's spent the night watching the plane, his brother comes with all of their little buddies, and as brothers do, they taunt each other. And so our friend Arthur tells his brother Jess, you cannot fly it. And Jess is saying, I can fly this plane. Watch me, I can fly it. So his intent is to get his brother to swing the prop, get a prop going, and he's going to taxi down the runway. The problem with his thinking is that, first of all, he only weighed 120 pounds, so he was pretty light. Second of all, the wind was in the plane's favor, not in his. And third of all, he had a very light fuel load. So as he begins taxiing, The wind comes behind him, and the thing gets going ahead of him, and next thing he knows, he's up in the air. At which point, I mean, it gets a pretty good distance. I think it said it was either 100 feet or 100 yards. Probably 100 yards. It runs out of fuel. So he manages to circle back, land the plane, at which point his brother and all of their buddies were so excited, they ran and got him some more gas. But he solos for the first time at 12 years old, only 4 days after having taken his first flight. And so with that, we see that it kind of set the course for the rest of his life. Within about a year and a half or so, his family has left Corpus Christi. They're now in Pine Bluff, and he begins commuting by motorcycle to Stuttgart to work for Richard Schilberg. So at this point, Schilberg now has clients out of state, and some of his pilots were a little bit less than reliable. And one in particular was supposed to deliver a plane to Jackson, Mississippi, and apparently had some unbecoming behavior, was unable to deliver the plane. So now our 15-year-old Jess Dockery goes to Schilberg and says, I can do it. So this guy, the plane had been ordered by a Cadillac dealer in Jackson. He flies the plane down there. This dealer handed him $2,800 in cash for the plane. He tips him $100 for delivering the plane. And then when Dockery gets back to Stuttgart and hands all of the money, or hands the price of the plane over to Schilberg, Schilberg then pays him $20 so to fly it down there. But made his first solo flight delivering a plane at 15 years old. Soon after that, though, he returns to Oklahoma and begins working for a gentleman named Burl Tibbs, who had a flight school there. And so he's working as a flight instructor, and because he's not officially a flight instructor, he can't solo with the pilots, but he's doing pretty much everything else. And he trains a number of notable pilots, including two gentlemen named Paul Braniff and Wiley Post. Wiley Post, for those of you who don't know, because I didn't, he discovered the jet stream. He also was the first pilot to solo around the world, and he was Will Rogers' personal pilot. Unfortunately, he was also with Will Rogers when their plane crashed in Alaska, and they both passed away in 1935. But Paul Braniff will pop up again in Dockery's life soon. But by the mid-20s, Dockery is the 90th person to get their pilot license. His is also signed by Orville Wright. And he also takes up barnstorming, although he was never really big into stunts and things like that, but he did fly the Crazy Loons who did the aerial acrobatics. And that's where he meets Charles Lindbergh. He and Lindbergh also signed up to fly as male pilots. The problem for Mr. Dockery is that he wasn't old enough. He was only 16, and so he had to fudge his birth year on his application to say that he was actually 21 in order to be able to fly as a male pilot. But very quickly after that, he gets involved with crop dusting, and that's where he becomes even more integral to our history. A young man named Alan Scott, who was also from Pine Bluff, and Dockery were credited with helping rig an airplane unload bags of insecticide in Leland, Mississippi during an outbreak of a heavy leaf worm. And some of the notes at that time say, at this particular time, which was around 1924, the Delta's crops were being decimated by army worms eating at the plant stalks. When he heard of the Finley aircraft based in the vicinity, B.J. Young, who was a general manager at Delta and Pine Land Company, approached another man, as well as Dockery and our friend Scott, to ask if they thought the poison could be effectively dropped from the plane. They all answered in the affirmative. And the quote says, there were 200 acres of cotton with worms eating it up. Well, I got the standard in the air, and after finding the bend in the river, went down over those big cypress trees and pulled the shovel handle. And that was the last time I could find it. I headed back for the landing field, my eyes and mouth full of dust and spitting mud and cotton, it seemed like. After some figuring, we put in a bulkhead and sealed around it, which improved the operation considerably. With this and other modifications, we were able to work there over a month putting out that poison. To the best of my knowledge, that was the beginning of commercial crop dusting with an airplane. And that's a quote from Mr. Dockery. But just to put it into perspective, farmers were so desperate to eradicate the worms from their crops, they had been spreading it by mule. And this poison was so toxic, it literally ate the hide off of their mules. So to put it in, our context of they were losing their tractors basically for their crops. And so what he ended up doing, pioneering, made a tremendous impact for years to come. In the late 1920s, in fact, March 1927, at only 18 years old, which sounds young to us, but wasn't at the time, he marries his lovely wife, Irene Borman. She was from Louisiana. Miss Irene was only 16 years old. And then a year later, he becomes one of the first 3 pilots hired by Paul Braniff when Mr. Braniff founded Braniff Airlines. So he flies, and then he had a number of other things that he was doing in the middle of there, but he flies for about 4 years, 3 to 4 years for Braniff before he gets a little bored with ferrying customers around, and he decides to open his own crop dusting business. So he initially starts in Clarksdale, Mississippi, but he moves his operations to Stuttgart, and one of the reasons was noted it was because of the area becoming known for progressive farming techniques. So, and of course he would become a large part of that as well. You can see some of the photos of him around in that time in the airport. But it says around 1936 he began dusting the green prairie when army worms were devastating the oat crop. He was contacted by A.G. Duncan in 1938 of Stuttgart's Airport Committee and asked to consider basing his operation in that city. Dockery was quick to respond favorably and brought 8 aircraft along with him. But he ends up building, and we're going to see the same photo that we just saw a little while ago, he builds hangars out there at the same place where Schilberg had operated last. And according to some people in the know, this area kind of in between right here is probably where the runway was. It's leveled, it's raised up a little bit, there's some concrete that's still there. You can kind of see where it was when you're out there on the ground. I'd hope to be able to get out there and get some pictures, so maybe I can do that if I can get out of here for a minute today. But he then names it, of course, J.O. Dockery Airport. He also is a tremendous pioneering pilot for this area because in 1939 he became the first pilot in the Mississippi Valley to seed rice from the air. So I had to rely on some friends for research here, but I remember that being talked about when I was a kid, and apparently that was something that they did between the late 30s to probably the late 60s, started phasing it out at that point. But it's still the primary way of seeding rice in California for a number of different reasons. But he left a lasting impression with that as well. And that's a picture of him loading his plane with the seed. But Mr. Dockery experienced a 70-year career, flying over 60,000 hours. And at one point, he had upwards of 100 planes and operations in 27 states, plus Mexico and South America. He also taught ferry pilots during World War II, but he was convinced to return to agricultural aviation because we needed food, and that was the best way he could serve his country during the Second World War. He and his lovely wife, Irene, were married until her death in 1983. They raised 2 daughters together, both of whom ended up married to men who were pilots, and Mr. Dockery was actually able to fly with both of his sons-in-laws and also with his grandson. He passed away in 1997, but he was posthumously inducted into the Arkansas Aviation Hall of Fame in 2019. Just a final little footnote, there were so many other people that I would have loved to have talked about, and as I was advised that I should call this part 1. But one of those people was actually Arthur Rhodes' younger brother, Buddy, who ended up being an aerial acrobat and was quite a character here around town. I want to close with a quote from Buddy that I found interesting when he was interviewed in a 1970 article for the Stuttgart Standard. It says, Buddy admits to a certain amount of awe about the aviation world of today. It's come so fast, he said. To think a person can land on the moon and the President of the United States can talk to him is unbelievable. And we're just scratching the surface.